Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our fifth meeting. Delighted to see so many here. We're so lucky to have Sir Malcolm Rifkind with us. And if you remember what the website said only until a few days ago, it said he was coming along. He was going to be the latest of our distinguished speakers to talk about, in broad terms, Britain's place in the world. And maybe that's something for another time. That would be nice to think of that. But he phoned me on Sunday and suggested that we change our plans because of the issues that you now know about, the eruption of Israel and Palestine. So that will be tonight's theme. Sir Malcolm does say that, though, if you want to ask wider questions in the Q&A beyond that conflict and beyond what he has to say tonight, he will do his best to address those questions. So remember that when we come to the interval. And just a quick review of this issue with world affairs. For those with long memories, Israel-Palestine, although it was a quiet topic for us in recent years, it was very much on the agenda with my predecessor, and there were a series of speakers, very often educated diaspora Palestinians would come and please the case. He also invited someone from a Friends of Israel organization that came to sort of put their counter of view as well, and that was often how it was done over the years. The balancing personality was probably the late Professor Rosemary Hollis, a great favorite here and on our advisory panel until her untimely death. And she, of course, brought the insight of a specialist in what the world powers were doing in the Middle East and the effect that the negative, very often, effect they had had upon it. And we may hear about that tonight as well. We have had other people coming, like Chris Doyle, who came several times. And here you could be meeting a speaker who is involved in educating us. He's the director of the Council for Arab-British Understanding. And, of course, he also went on protests in London at times. So you get a mixture of people with knowledge and with an activist position. And the final speaker that I'd like to mention came about 4 years ago, who was quite interesting for you as a group, and that was Daniel Levy, because he's a British citizen, Jewish, who also became an Israeli citizen, and it's quite possible that Sir Malcolm would have met him 20-odd years ago, because he was a junior member of the team that tried to negotiate peace with the Palestinians, in which, by all accounts, nearly succeeded. So we've had a variety of people who've brought a perspective on this thorny, long-running problem. And now we turn to it because of this great crisis that we see before us. I can think of no better person than Sir Malcolm Rifkind to guide us through it, because, as you've seen from his biography, he has this vast experience as a minister for 18 years, particularly as Defense Secretary and Foreign Secretary. And as he has explained, and I've mentioned in the email to you, he has also been involved in as an envoy and involved in talks in the past, and he's still very close to the situation. So it's going to be a most informative evening. I look forward to what Sir Malcolm Rifkind has to say.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I must say, on such a filthy night, I am most impressed at the number of people who have chosen to come this evening. I remember on one occasion in my political life, I was speaking in a village hall somewhere in the Scottish borders on a night like this, and I expected there would be about 4 people there, and the place was packed. And when I started speaking, I said, "Can everybody at the back hear me?" And somebody at the back shouted, "No, I can't," at which somebody at the front said, "Well, I can. Would you like to change seats?" It wasn't a very complimentary thing to say, but there we are. I'm extremely grateful to your chairman for sparing me long biographical details, which is normally what a speaker gets, how I did this and that and the other and so forth. It can be sometimes quite disconcerting. President Lyndon Johnson of the United States was once the recipient of an extremely fulsome and complimentary introduction. And when he got up to speak, he said, "Thank you so much. That is the sort of introduction which my father would have enjoyed and my mother would have believed." I'm conscious that half the purpose of these evenings are the questions you want to put to me. So I'm not going to make a sort of go on and on, drone on and on and on for the greater part of the evening. I shall follow the wise precedent of King Henry VIII, who apparently said to each of his 6 wives, "Please don't worry, I don't intend to keep you long." So what I'm going to do, and that's going to become a lot more serious than I've been in the last few minutes, is obviously share with you my thoughts. And I'm a private citizen now. I'm no longer a minister. I served as a minister for 18 years. That was quite long enough. Someone once remarked, a minister always knows when he's retired. It's when you climb into the back of your car and it doesn't go anywhere. So that is behind me. So let us turn to serious matters. So the subject it is an incredibly serious crisis, and one can hardly exaggerate its importance. But I think one of the great failings nowadays, when people go into either discussing or presenting their views or interviewed on television or speaking in Parliament, they don't even spend a few minutes thinking about where this crisis has come from. Because crises very rarely just suddenly erupt out of nowhere. They have not only a background, but they have a historic background. And if many of you here will already be informed about that and may be already familiar with what I'm going to start by saying, but some of you may be less informed. Why should you have been if it's not something directly affecting you? So it's worth bearing in mind that the crisis that is being dealt with or attempting to be dealt with in the Middle East at the moment has its roots more than 150 years ago. And it's one of these relatively unusual but not known crises that erupt in various parts of the world, where you have 2 groups of people or 2 communities or 2 people with a national identity who all believe that they have an entitlement either to all or most of a particular part of the surface of the earth. And sometimes it's quite easy to say who's in the right and who's in the wrong. And if we think of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that's a good example in my personal view, where the rights and the wrongs are pretty obvious, and it's not too difficult to say that what is happening is a victim and an oppressor. But when you come not just to the Middle East, not just to Israel and the Palestinians, there are 1 or 2 issues of this kind. You find huge conflict which is rooted in history. And when we look at the Israelis and the Palestinians, they both have a claim, certainly believe they have a claim, a very strong claim, not just to a bit of land, but to a territory which the whole world is familiar with as the Holy Land, and which has a history going back not just hundreds of years, but thousands of years. So on the one hand, you have the Israelis. They're not 100% Jewish. 80% are. 20% of Israel are Israeli Arabs. But the vast majority are Jewish. And obviously the creation of the State of Israel was a cause that began in the 19th century, in the 1800s, when many Jews, primarily from Europe, but also from other areas, felt that they needed to have a national home. They had been dispersed for 2,000 years, originally coming from the Holy Land, but dispersed for various historic reasons, which, of course, easy to find out why if one's not already familiar. And whether it was because of persecution, that was part of the reason. But remember also that what was happening in the 19th century, not just in the Middle East, was a growing belief that each community that saw itself as having a national identity should have its own country, should have its own national state. And that was happening in Europe. That's why Germany became a single country, having been split between dozens of small states for a very long time. But it wasn't just in Germany. It was happening all over Europe, and then it began to happen all over the world. as countries in Africa and Asia and the Caribbean. And so when the United Nations was formed, there only were 40 or 50 countries. Today there's 180 countries in the United Nations. And so many Jews in the late 19th century created a philosophy called Zionism, which was a return to the ancestral home of their ancestors. And that was something which became hugely important. Of course, it took on a particular poignancy and significance after the Holocaust during the Nazi period in Europe. But at the same time, that belief in a national identity was also influencing many people who saw themselves as Arabs, but at that time, in the late 19th, early 20th century, were part of the Ottoman Empire, ruled by Turkey from Istanbul, by the Sultan. And the Turks were not Arabs. And so you also had, particularly during the First World War, Lawrence of Arabia was associated with this. The aspiration of the Arabs should not only free themselves from Turkey, but to start off with, they felt they should have a state, but for various reasons which I won't go into, that never proved to be possible. And so you had Syria, you had Lebanon, you had Jordan, you had Iraq, and then one other final part of that patchwork was what was known geographically as Palestine. It wasn't a political, it had never been a state called Palestine. And the Palestinians were Arabs, as were those in Iraq and Jordan and so forth. But when all the other areas of the region achieved their own statehood, obviously the Arabs living in Palestine started saying, well, we should have a similar right. So that's how it, in a sense, began. And as many in this audience will be familiar, of course, when this began to come to be a dominant issue in that region, after the First World War, it happened to fall to our country, the United Kingdom, to have the mandate for Palestine. And so from 1920 to 1948, 28 years, incredibly difficult, as successive British governments tried to hold the balance between those Jews now living in Palestine who wanted to move towards a national home. And of course, when Arthur Balfour was in power, there was declared what became known as the Balfour Declaration, when the British government said not that there should be a Jewish state exclusive for the Jews, but that there should be a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which might one day, it was assumed, become a state. But the assumption then was that it would be combined with a similar homeland for the Palestinian Arabs as well. That was the aspiration. It's when you try to reconcile things that sometimes aren't reconcilable that you get into real problems. And so as Britain discovered throughout all the years of the mandate, right up to 1948, Britain was trying to balance the competing demands of the Arabs and of the Jews, each of whom had political and statehood aspirations, but were not prepared to recognize the rights of the other. Neither were. The Jews started off hoping they would be able to control either all or most of what was then Palestine, but the Arabs had a similar aspiration in the opposite direction and did not accept the legitimacy of any other solution. So that is the background. Now, as early as the 1930s, during the British Mandate, and it wasn't just Britain, the League of Nations was involved as well, of course, the concept developed, at least on the part of the British government and of the rest of the world, well, maybe the territory needs to be divided into two territories. And that is what eventually the United Nations voted for in 1947, 48, when the United Nations General Assembly voted, something by 2/3 of a majority, that Palestine should be partitioned. There should be an Israeli state, called Israel, if that's what the Israelis wanted, but there should also be similar rights for the Palestinians. And at that time, the Palestinians and all the Arab states refused to accept that. Not just the Palestinians themselves, but also Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Jordan. And when Israel declared its independence in 1948, all these governments, we don't have governments today going to war with Israel. It's organizations like Hamas or Hezbollah. But in 1948, Israel was almost extinguished as it was being born. And of course, it was a much smaller Israel in those days, I mean in terms of population. Today, Israel has a population of about 10 million people, of whom about 8 million are Jewish, 2 million are Arabs. Then the population was probably about 1 million, I don't know the exact figure. And they were being attacked simultaneously by the Egyptian army, the Syrian army, the Jordanian army, some from other Arab countries. But they were not major armies, if the truth be told. And in that war of independence, when people are fighting for their own sense of their own ultimate fate, they fight harder and sometimes more successfully, as we've seen with the Ukrainians being able, for many months, to outsmart the Russians, much larger. So the Israelis won what they called their war of independence. And Israel then became a state with only part of the territory under its control. But then you had, and many of you will remember, the Six-Day War, 1967, when Nasser, the president of Egypt, with other Arab governments like Syria, attacked Israel, but it didn't work. They were defeated in an incredibly short period of time. And the effect of that was Israel controlled not just the whole of Palestine, but Sinai as well, right up to the Suez Canal and the Golan Heights, which had been part of Syria. So that transformed the situation, because for the first time, the Israeli government, it was persuaded to reach a deal with the Egyptians after a few years to hand Sinai back. And Sinai was handed back to the Egyptians, and Egypt and Israel have had diplomatic relations ever since then. But the rest of the original Palestine mandate effectively was under Israeli control. The Israelis did not annex it. They didn't say this is part of Israel. But effectively, they controlled it and have controlled it, both the West Bank and Gaza ever since. Now, it's worth remembering that when that happened, already there was the question mark, well, what's going to happen to the West Bank and Gaza? Because they not only weren't a state, a Palestinian state, they didn't even have the structure of a potential state at that time. And what basically then took place was various changes over the last 30, 40 years. Some of you will be familiar, but might not be able to remember exactly what happened in what order. Because the most important development after the Six-Day War was what became known as the Oslo Accords. And that's because there were some secret negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians in Oslo, sponsored by the Norwegian government, which led to a certain measure of agreement. And when that was then worked on by the Israeli government and by the Palestinians, led that time by Yasser Arafat, that led to an agreement which was actually implemented, which said that for their part, for the Israelis, would agree to the West Bank and Gaza not becoming independent, though that was not ruled out for the long term, but at that time that wasn't being talked about, but having their own self-government, what was called autonomy, a Palestinian authority, an elected Palestinian government in all but name, that would have responsible for all internal matters, domestic issues. They would not be a separate state, but who knows over the years what that might have led to. And in return, Arafat agreed that the Palestinians would recognize Israel as an independent state and would not use violence, which up till then they had been, not terrorism, there had been bits of terrorism, some aspects of terrorism, but it was mostly a question of whether they would have a military force attacking Israel. They agreed to renounce the use of military means and have stuck to that. For the most part, I mean, not 100%, but to the most part, unlike Hamas in Gaza, which I'll come to in a moment. So that was a period of considerable hope. And it led to various attempts to take it one stage further. And when I was Foreign Secretary in 1990s, I was the first British minister to commit the United Kingdom to a two-state solution to resolve this issue for the long term. Now, we weren't in charge, we weren't in control, but all the major international countries had to have a view on these matters. And that was the view that the then British government, and all British governments, regardless of party, have held since the 1990s as official policy. It actually, at some stage, looked as if it might be going somewhere. there was an extraordinary relationship that developed between Yitzhak Rabin, then Prime Minister of Israel, and Yasser Arafat. They got to meet each other. And you remember the famous remark that Mrs. Thatcher made after she met Mr. Gorbachev? I think he's a man with whom we can do business. Rabin, who had been an Israeli general, one of the generals who had won the Six-Day War, had effectively become a diplomat, a prime minister, and took the view there had to be a political, not just a military solution to the problems. And Arafat, much more cautiously, finding it very much more difficult, nevertheless grew to feel that he could actually work with Rabin. And then, as you will all recall, tragically, Rabin was assassinated at the time he was prime minister. And the following day, a few days later, I went with John Major, he was prime minister, to the state funeral of Rabin in Israel. One of the people there, one of the people who'd chosen to come was King Hussein of Jordan. The following day, and it's a personal story, but it's one very relevant to what we're discussing this evening. The following day, it had been, when the funeral was behind us, my program was to make various other visits in the area. And on that first day, I was driven to Gaza to see Yasser Arafat, whom I had met once before in Gaza the year before, to discuss, because we did have contact, we didn't recognize them in the full political sense, but we had a dialogue with the Palestinians, as we've had for most of the last 30, 40 years. And in that conversation, after about the previous year, we'd had an hour and a half. On this occasion, after 40 minutes, he said, "I'm terribly sorry. I'm going to have to bring this meeting to an end now because I am being driven to Israel to see Mrs. Leah Rabin, Rabin's widow, to pay my condolences." This was Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader. And I mention this because that would be inconceivable today. We haven't just not gone forward, we've gone terribly backward in what was possible. So let us then look at what has happened, because the changes that have happened over the last 30 years, since Rabin's funeral, there were further attempts to get an Israeli-Palestinian deal. When Ehud Barak was the Israeli prime minister, Arafat was still the Palestinian leader, and that was some 4 or 5 years later. And with the assistance of Bill Clinton, who was president of the United States, they almost did a deal. And the deal would have been, what was being discussed, was that the Palestinians would control the whole of Gaza and 85% of the West Bank, because already there were quite a number of Israeli settlements that had been established there. And even part of East Jerusalem would be available to a Palestinian state as part of its capital if it wanted that. And the Israeli cabinet actually ratified what Barak had been negotiating on behalf of Israel. They said, "We can accept this." Sadly, at the last moment, Arafat pulled back. Why? Because he took the view 85% should be 100%, and he wasn't prepared to compromise. And that was a tragic mistake, because whether or not it was good or bad to only have 85%, that would have put it into the cement, as it were, the fixture of an entity called Palestine, which would have moved towards full statehood with much less difficulty than might be the case today. So that's the history I wanted to share with you. Now let's come straight to where we are now. There's a lot's happened in between, but I don't have the time to go into that in detail. So what we've had essentially over the last 20 years is no progress on a two-state solution. Some blame the Israelis for that, and it's true that Netanyahu and many Israeli politicians do not want to see ever a Palestinian state, which they believe would be a threat to Israel. That is undoubtedly true. Not all Israelis. Israel is divided on this issue. And Israel is a democracy. People express their views on both sides of the argument. But also the Israeli settlements in the West Bank have grown, and many of them are illegal. But at the same time, what has happened on the Palestinian side is that the Palestinians have become themselves divided between the party called Fatah, led by Arafat's successor, Mahmoud Abbas, who control the West Bank, who are, by standards compared to Hamas, are moderate, do not use terrorism or violence, actually have informal cooperation with the Israelis to try and ensure that there's a proper security situation in force, but are not very popular with their own people because it's sometimes too accommodating, it is believed, to the Israelis. They originally had responsibility for Gaza, but then Hamas in 2007, now almost 20 years ago, were able to take power there and have effectively become a dictatorship there. And they have the support, nobody knows for certain, but opinion polls, there have been polls in Gaza, which suggest that Hamas has the support of approximately half the population, with half the Palestinians wishing they weren't there and were not in charge. Who knows for certain whether that is correct? So we then come to October this year, and what then happened. And I think I'm being entirely objective when I say that what happened was quite unprecedented in the whole history of the Israeli-Palestinian controversies. Not the fact that Hamas were attacking Israel or sending rockets or even trying to send some of their militants across the border, but it was what was clearly a decision taken at the highest leadership of Hamas, not just to attack Israeli settlements, but to murder as many men, women, and children as they could get hold of, and to do so in the most gruesome fashion on video. On video, this is not just allegations on one side denied by the other. It's never been denied. And the videos exist for some of these murders that were taken place. Not to mention, of course, the 200 hostages, who were not soldiers. One or two of them were, but mostly men, women, children, elderly people, disabled people, all sorts of things. Now, there is a precedent for that. It was called ISIS. And you remember in that part of the world. And you remember when ISIS took control of part of Iraq and Syria, and we had these gruesome videos on television of British and American prisoners they'd taken, being held by hooded men before they were decapitated. And it was filmed. So at that time, there was no controversy that when an international force was able successfully to effectively eradicate ISIS as a serious military force by recovering all the ground that they controlled in Iraq and in Syria. There's still some people who call themselves ISIS, but they're now very fragmentary. They control no territory. And they cannot, at least at the moment, represent a serious threat to any country in the Middle East or elsewhere. There's a lot of controversy as to whether we should have a ceasefire at the moment in Gaza, whether the Israelis should stop fighting and so forth. There are circumstances when there's a dispute when a ceasefire can make sense. But I'm giving a personal view. I'm not telling you what you must believe yourselves. Each one of you will have your own views. I do not believe it is remotely reasonable to expect the Israelis to accept a ceasefire while Hamas remain, first of all, armed in the way they've been armed over the last few years, and secondly, while all the evidence is that given the opportunity, they would repeat what they did 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago again. I mean, imagine, it's difficult to do parallels, but we had the problem with the IRA for years. Now imagine this never happened, but imagine if the IRA had crossed into parts of Northern Ireland and murdered 1,000 Northern Irish men, women, and children, butchered them in the way that we saw. The overwhelming demand from our own country would be on the British government to send the army in and take whatever was required to make sure that could never happen again. And we wouldn't be talking about ceasefires as long as they were armed and able to repeat the atrocities that had already been implemented. So that's my personal view. And when we come to Q&A, please disagree with that if you feel it appropriate. Let me say what the issues are, because it's not as simple as whether the Israelis can simply, as they are doing, sending their army in and destroying Hamas militarily. You've all, if you're interested, have read how difficult that will be for them. It's not impossible. It happened successfully with ISIS, but Hamas, although they do not have sophisticated military equipment, they are trained, they do have modern equipment, but it's light arms. But they have also the tunnels, 300 kilometers of tunnels under Gaza, very difficult to eradicate if the threat is to be removed. But the question that the Israelis will also have to deal with is, okay, even if we are successful militarily, what then happens to Gaza? Because if Hamas are successfully destroyed as the kind of terrorist organization they are at the moment, and the British government, with the support of the Labour Party and other parties, labels them a terrorist organization. This is not just an Israeli perspective. Virtually the whole of the Western world describes Hamas as a terrorist organization. Even before they went into mass atrocities, they were labeled in that way because of their methods. So they aren't going to be permitted if the Israelis have been militarily successful. But the Israelis don't want to stay in Gaza. It's the last thing they want to do. The Israelis were in Gaza militarily up till 2007. And the Israeli government then, under Sharon, a pretty right-wing Israeli prime minister, said, no, they have to be left to govern themselves. So it is difficult to see an easy alternative. There will be alternatives. And my own best guess would be that if the Israelis are successful militarily, they don't have to 100% destroy Hamas. What they have to do is so degrade and diminish their military capability that they would never be capable of carrying out the kind of attack and the kind of atrocities that we saw a few weeks ago. So I think the most likely thing that would happen would be that you would have a temporary military administration, because somebody has to keep the peace in Gaza. But there also has to be the restructuring of its public utilities. The United Nations could easily be part of the solution to that, with a number of countries, preferably including Arab states like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan, providing some of the help. Whether they'd be willing to, or whether it would seem as if they were condoning what the Israelis had done, that will make it much more difficult to achieve. But that's what diplomats are for, to deliver results when results are required. So far as the humanitarian issues are concerned, I think we've all been conscious that a lot of innocent people, both Israelis and Palestinians, have been killed, are being killed, and are likely to continue being killed. But you know, there has never been a war where that has not tragically happened. We all remember the huge ethical dilemmas during the Second World War, when not just the German government, the Hitler government, but British government bombed Dresden in retaliation to the bombing of Coventry. And these were not military targets primarily. And it was felt, it was justified. Churchill endorsed it. British public opinion said, we're in a world war. This is existential. This is our liberty at stake. We have to defeat these people. And that is what sometimes happens. So it's not a question of whether one defends it. One simply says that the human race has not yet advanced to a degree of wisdom, to a degree of dispassionate approach to these sort of dilemmas. When you are fighting for your very freedom, you say whatever is needed, we have to, however sadly, however tragically, accept. Now, that does not mean that either side is entitled to do what it likes when it comes to civilian casualties. Hamas makes no secret of the fact that it deliberately targets whoever it can get hold of and kills civilians, sometimes as a deliberate target. We don't have any evidence that the Israelis ever deliberately want to kill civilians. But they do know, and they don't deny, that if you bomb targets which you believe are military targets, if they're in built-up areas of a city or of a town or whatever, then people will be killed or injured. And if you believe, and they say the evidence is overwhelming, that Hamas deliberately puts underneath a school or a hospital or some other building its military control centers in the hope that that will protect them from being attacked, then that becomes an incredibly difficult dilemma, how you deal with that kind of situation if it is a major threat. I'm going to speak just for another 10 minutes or so before we break and then come back for questions. And what I want to just finish with is two questions. First of all, a lot of people are understandably anxious, will this war spread? Is it just going to be the Israelis and the Palestinians? Or will it spread first in the Middle East? And might it start involving the major powers like the United States, like Russia, China, whoever it might be, Iran, whoever it may be? Well, we don't know for certain. You can't predict these things with any certainty. But you can, in the light of what we know, I think you can say what is most probable. First of all, the Israeli military is known to be not just far stronger than Hamas, but far stronger. It's by far the strongest army in the Middle East. That is not denied by anyone. And therefore, if, for example, Hezbollah, which is not Palestinian, Hezbollah are entirely Lebanese, but they're from the Lebanese Shia section of the community. They are very close to Iran, because Iran is a Shia country, unlike most of the Muslim world. And Iran, and I'm not exaggerating here, virtually helped create Hezbollah as a militia so close to Israel, it would help Iran achieve its rather grim objectives in the Middle East. So it is at least a possibility that Hezbollah could start using, and they have very many rockets and missiles and so forth, across the border to attack Israel. They couldn't defeat Israel, but they could do an enormous amount of damage. But then, of course, we now have a United States aircraft carrier in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that carrier probably has, well, we know has something like 75 fighter planes on it. And probably every one of them can fire cruise missiles or some equivalent if required. Now, what I'm about to say is what I guess has happened. We don't know this because no public statements have been made. But my guess is that the Americans, a lot of diplomacy takes place without being declared. The best diplomacy is not done in public. It's done in private. And almost certainly the Americans will be saying, not just to Hezbollah in Lebanon, but to their paymasters in Iran, that if Hezbollah was to attack Israel, then the Americans have the capacity, because of their aircraft carrier, to respond and attack Hezbollah for doing so. I don't know that for certain, but I would be surprised if that is not a conversation that has taken place, and which in part explains why Hezbollah, at least up till today, have not got themselves involved in this conflict. Final point I want to say is, what about the future? Because when wars end, you either do nothing or you try to learn lessons. The Israelis have already said publicly that they acknowledge that what has happened, the fact that Hamas were able to do what they did, was at least in part, and to a significant degree, because unexpectedly their own intelligence agencies and their own army had woefully failed to anticipate the risks that were being run. But the one person who has not yet accepted comparable responsibility is the Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu. And that's very much in style of his personality. I won't go into that at the moment. But what is clear, because Israel, as I mentioned earlier, is a democracy, it's an open society. It has genuine opinion polls. And what is already clear is that something like 80% of Israelis, possibly even 90%, believe that once the immediate crisis is over, the current government, Netanyahu in particular, must step down, because they will be seen as having failed in their prime duty, particularly as Netanyahu spent the last 9 months trying to change the domestic law in Israel. And you saw all the huge demonstrations of Israelis against their own government week after week on these issues. Well, that meant they were not concentrating on national security, but had become obsessed with domestic politics, and they will not be forgiven for that. But my final point is this, and it's what I hope will happen, and what ought to happen, is that senior Israelis, because they will have a general election sometime in the next few months to choose the kind of government they wish, should say, okay, if they have been successful in defeating Hamas, that gives us some security that we require, but you will never get the kind of security we yearn for unless there is a political solution as well as a military solution to the issues that divide us from the Palestinians. So what they ought to say, what I hope they will say, and to some degree think they must say, is we must resume a genuine political dialogue with the Palestinians once this immediate fighting is over, to see what is the long-term relationship going to be between Israelis and Palestinians. Now, I don't think it's naive to say that, because as I tried to explain a few moments ago, there have been one or two examples in the last 30, 40 years when they came almost within a breadth of reaching agreements, which failed at the last moment. It's not as if this is something that has never even made progress. So if there's a will on the Israeli side, there might be a will on the Palestinian side as well. And we know that's what the Arab states themselves want. Saudi Arabia, until 3 weeks ago, was talking with America about what it would need for Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel and have normal diplomatic relations, which would have been inconceivable 20, 30 years ago. So the Arab states, the governments, do not support Hamas, quite the opposite. They hate Hamas as they hated ISIS. They can't express that in the way that they might wish to, because a lot of their public opinion, ordinary people emotionally committed to the Palestinian cause, would resent it if their governments were attacking Hamas at this moment. But there is hope. I'm going to end by saying something which I hope you won't think is frivolous, but is nevertheless, I think, relevant. There is a marvelous apocryphal story, I don't know whether it's true or not, that an Israeli and a Palestinian once went to see God. You'll have to decide for yourself how likely this is, but they went to see God. And in the presence of the Almighty, they said, we are an Israeli and a Palestinian. We've come to ask you jointly, will there ever be peace? Will there ever be a real permanent relationship between our two communities and between our two peoples? God said, yes, of course there will. I have not the slightest doubt about it. But it won't be in my time. Just a moment. It's sad and it's funny, but you know, I once, in Israel, as Foreign Secretary, met Shimon Peres, a great Israeli politician, became Prime Minister, Foreign Minister. And when we were discussing, was it really possible to have a solution between Israelis and Palestinians? He said, Mr. Rifkind, you have to remember one thing. In Israel, miracles take longer. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And you've overwhelmed us with questions tonight. Thank you. I'm struggling tonight, but I will do my best to represent you. And we have microphones, do we? There's Harry there, and we've got Liv upstairs, right? So, sorry, it's Zine. Yes, okay, Zina, good. Right, just put up your hand if you want the microphone just now. Let's just see if there's anyone. Otherwise, I'll get underway. There will be a question down here, and put your hand up upstairs if you want to. But I'm going to start off with some questions. So we need to go back to a bit of history. Let me find it. No, we are going to... Yes, the Balfour Declaration. It has moved away from me. I will come... yeah, someone wants you to clarify the... About the Balfour Declaration. But
Shall I give the answer while you're finding the question?
Yes, if you know, that would be a good idea. But actually, what Steve Lake is asking, I found it, is how important was the Balfour Declaration in the formation of Israel, and would the state have been created irrespective of that declaration?
Right. It's an interesting question. The answer is yes, it would have been created, but not in the same way. I think the fact that it was the Balfour Declaration, a declaration of a British government, and Britain had the mandate in Palestine, inevitably meant that the British government, and not just at that moment, over the next 30 years, had a responsibility to try and deliver what they had said. But of course, it was also very controversial, because although, what was important, the Balfour Declaration was not completely one-sided. It said that there should be a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. It didn't say a state, but that was implied, a homeland, but without damaging the legitimate political interests of the non-Jewish population. So that was the attempted balance. But of course, not that many people read the small print. And overwhelmingly, and understandably, the Balfour Declaration was seen as a very major step, given that Britain was the mandate government in assisting the aspirations of the Zionist movement to actually create a state of Israel. And certainly from the Arab point of view, it was seen as something adverse to their interests.
Helen, Susan, and Claudia want to know, what is the role of the PLO? Given your historical narrative, what's their role in the current situation, so historically and now?
Right. For most of the years that we're talking about, the main Palestinian organization fighting for Palestinian rights or a Palestinian state was the Palestine Liberation Organization, known as the PLO, and whose leader throughout virtually all those years was Yasser Arafat. When, after the Oslo Accords, the decision was taken and implemented to create a Palestinian authority, which, although it was not a government, would have the responsibility. It was more than a council, a local authority. It was like a miniature government, but it would have the responsibility for the internal affairs, education, health, housing, roads, a whole range of issues in the West Bank and originally in Gaza. And therefore, what gradually happened was that the Palestinian Authority became more important than the PLO. And what also happened was the split in the Palestinian political leadership between what became Hamas, primarily in Gaza, very much more religiously focused as well as politically focused, so very Islamic, not just Palestinian nationalism, but Islamic Brotherhood type of issues, and what became known as Fatah, which is what governs the West Bank at the moment, which was equally nationalist, but more secular. They were all Muslims, but they did not see themselves as Islamists. They saw themselves more as secular Palestinians with a different aspiration.
Let's turn to Hamas, and slightly historical and slightly current. Claire wonders what circumstances have caused Hamas to grow. Gerald, what did Hamas hope to achieve with such a savage attack? What was their end game? And Joe Sexton, if Israel cuts off the head of the snake, Hamas, surely another one will arise. So what's the point of trying to eliminate it?
Okay, if I can deal with the last one first. You can't eliminate an idea, and you cannot eliminate entirely people following that idea. But as we've seen with both Al-Qaeda and with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, after the attack on the Twin Towers, they were given refuge in Afghanistan by the then Taliban government, and the United States, supported by many countries, were able to eliminate them, not entirely, they still exist, but, fingers crossed, we have not had anything remotely like the Twin Tower attack since then. And if you think even in the United Kingdom, we had, if you remember, the London bombings, which were several simultaneous bombings on the same day in various parts of London involving the tube, underground transport, and various else. That also has not been repeated. Now, it's dangerous to say it could not happen, but the actual reality is that for the last 10, 15 years, if they could have done it, they would have done it again. And the same was true with Islamic State when they were thrown out of Iraq and Syria. They still are quite active in various parts of the Sahara and the Sahel and various countries in West Africa, but they're a fraction of what they once were. That's what the Israelis would hope to achieve in relation to Hamas.
David Vincent has got a question, and Ian Watson has sort of question. I want to talk about the external powers that have sort of, if you like, encouraged or goaded Hamas to do what they did. So we'll look at David Vincent's question. He says, is Mr. Putin behind the latest situation in the Middle East? So is he the culprit? Ian Watson's question's framed rather differently. It's about Qatar. Hamas receives funding from Qatar of around $100 million a year and have an investment portfolio of $500 million, he says. As a prescribed terrorist organization, could these funds not be frozen and bank accounts closed to degrade Hamas? That's his question, but may we just couple with that the idea that Qatar might have an interest in Hamas's outrage as well.
Right. So far as Putin is concerned, so far as we know, Putin was not involved, and there's no reason why he should have been involved. He has not had, Russia have not had particular close relations with Hamas. They have, generally speaking, been supportive of attempts to destroy Islamic extremist organizations because they have a large Muslim minority in Russia, particularly in Chechnya, and in some of the more Muslim parts of the southern part of Russia. So that's been the general position. However, Putin is opportunistic, and particularly given the huge problems he has in Ukraine and the complete mess he's made of that, he will be very pleased that suddenly the world is focusing on not just another war, but there's another enemy to be attacked, namely the Israelis. So he has put out very unhelpful comments supporting essentially the Palestinian, unhelpful from the Israeli point of view, I should say, supporting the Palestinian position, not condoning what Hamas did, but implying that the Israelis deserved what they got, sort of thing. So there's been a lot of controversy over that. That is because he is trying to distract attention from Ukraine, and at the very least say, look, what I'm doing in Ukraine, you may not like, but compared to these terrible Israelis, I'm a great guy. Qatar is a very interesting case here. Qatar is, first of all, it's a tiny country. It's got an indigenous population of about 500,000. A lot of expatriates, low-income people who work there, but the population is about 500,000. And the Qatari, but they have access to vast amounts of gas, some of which they share with Iran. It's a gas field in the Persian Gulf. So they have used their extraordinary wealth, but they're conscious that they need to have their own national security. So they talk to everyone. And you have at the moment, it is indeed correct, as your questioner has pointed out, that Qatar has helped finance Gaza, run by Hamas, for the last few years. What is not so well known, but it has been published and it's not denied, is that that has been done with the agreement of both the Americans and the Israelis. Because until recently, the Israelis believed, and this is one of the big mistakes they made, that Hamas had temporarily given up the idea of attacking Israel and were concentrated on building up the economy of Gaza. But they would need external help to do that. And Qatar is not the only country, but one of the countries that was doing that. Qatar is also, at the same time that it has dialogue with Hamas, it also has dialogue with the Taliban, but within Qatar is America's biggest military base that it has anywhere in the Middle East. So Qatar is friendly with everyone. And it works rather well. If, from a Qatari point of view, it suits them down to the ground. They say, we will speak. And the Qataris were helping get some of the hostages released. They were the mediators. And they were helping get some Russian children, Ukrainian children, who'd been kidnapped by the Russians. You may have read a couple of weeks ago, they were released by Putin and allowed to go back to Ukraine, and it was the Qataris who were doing that. So they like to present themselves, tiny country, but we help everyone who needs help in a reasonable way. That's their position.
Yes. Do you have any view on...
No, I mean, I think the facts aren't in dispute. I mean, they have been... The Americans have said publicly that in terms of getting... You see, one of the great problems when you have a humanitarian problem, like hostages or children being kidnapped, if the two sides aren't even speaking each other, and particularly if they're actually fighting each other, can you negotiate any compromises when you're at daggers drawn, or when you are politically shunning any public meetings? And so the Ukrainians and the Russians have had no direct dialogue. So unless you get somebody able to mediate, and that can sometimes be a person who maybe have great personal authority, but sometimes usually it's either the Norwegians are good at it, or the Swedes or the Finns. Somehow the Scandinavians have done quite a bit of that. But countries like Qatar have built up a reputation for being actually quite successful. Because they have an office in Qatar where all the countries that do not recognize the Taliban can have very private conversations with the Afghan government.
So, right. So,
and it's better that should happen that way than that it shouldn't happen at all.
Yeah, so you see that as a force for good.
Yeah, on balance, yes, as long as it's properly controlled.
We're going to question right in front of you, on front row. Go ahead.
Oh, yes, good evening.
Speak louder.
Just treat it as an
on?
ice cream and talk into the top of it.
Is it? Oh, it's switched on now, yeah. Good evening, Sir Malcolm. The avowed intention of Hamas, I believe, is the elimination of the State of Israel.
Yes.
We can't hear you. Would you lift the microphone up a bit?
A little bit closer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
They surely realise they can't do that militarily, and they can't do it by the actions they have been doing. What do you call it? Terrorism.
Yeah, sure.
Do you think there's a possibility that their recent action was a deliberate provocation to elicit an overwhelming retaliation in the hope of discrediting Israel amongst the rest of the world, and even inducing other Arabic states to take part in helping them to eliminate the State of Israel?
It's a very good question that you have raised. I think, first of all, the question basically was, why have Hamas done this? What did they expect to get out of it? One of the things they're hoping to do one day is replace Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas, who run the West Bank. They would like to control the West Bank as well as Gaza. And therefore they will be saying to ordinary Palestinians on the West Bank, you may not like us very much, you may think we're too hard line or whatever, but by God, we've shocked the Israelis, we've killed the Israelis, we've done more damage to them than anyone's been able to do for years. We are the natural leaders of all Palestinians. That's one of their objectives. Their second objective is very similar to what you yourself just said, that they see that by the sheer horror and shock treatment of their behavior, that the Israelis would, as they have done, had to react. And I don't think the Israelis ever had a choice. They had to react. And that immediately divides public opinion in the Middle East, in Europe, in other parts of the world, because although there will be very few people putting up placards saying, I think it is right to murder women and children and take hostages, that's not what the placards are saying. What we've always had is a very substantial number of people. Take Britain, for example. We have a large Muslim community, and including a large number of people of Palestinian origin. And inevitably, on the wider issue of who is right and who is wrong in the Middle East, they will all overwhelmingly support the Palestinian point of view, just as most Jewish people in America or Britain will be more sympathetic to the Israeli point of view. But in addition to that, you also have a minority of political activists many of whom are, and I don't want to be partisan, but are from the sort of hard left of British politics, who see Israel as essentially a white colonial territory running in a bad way, controlling the lives of non-white people, and a sort of remnant of empire, of colonialism. And that's their particular, they probably would say that's not fair, but I'm giving my personal view. I think that is pretty close to what they believe, that Israel is a Western country, which it is, and which it claims to be. It was started by people of European origin. It's now got many Jews from the Middle East or from other parts of the world, but overwhelmingly, for the first years of its existence as a state, the Zionist movement was created in Europe by Europeans. And it was during the period of empire, during the colonial period. So that's why they like to compare Israel with South Africa. Because South Africa, apartheid was all whites versus blacks, and here there are Israelis versus Palestinians, and it's just another expression of the wicked Western way of life. Now, I'm slightly parodying it, but I think there's enough truth in that to make it a legitimate comment.
Can I pick up something you just said? Because Chris Nibbs wants to exercise a point. He says, why is the UK government not adopting a neutral stance given our significant population of Arabs or Muslims and Jews living peacefully side by side in the United Kingdom?
Because there are some issues you can't be neutral on. You're neutral either because your own national interest so overwhelmingly requires you not to get involved, or because you do not believe that either side has, as it were, a legitimate case to argue, or that the two sides are so equal in their rights and wrongs. Now, the British government's view has always been, it applies to all parties in being in power, Labour or Conservative, that first of all, Israel is entitled to exist as an independent state. Secondly, if it is entitled to be an independent state, it's entitled to defend itself if it's attacked. And whether it's attacked by another state or it's attacked by terrorists, they're entitled to defend themselves, as we would do in such a situation. And therefore, and on this occasion, there was a ceasefire, and it was Hamas that broke the ceasefire. For several years, the Israeli army had not sent its troops into Gaza, and Hamas had not sought to cross the border into Israel. One or two minor incidents, but no major conflict. Hamas, for its own motives, chose to break that ceasefire in a big way, and therefore the British government's view, and it happens to be the view of the French, the German, the American, pretty well all the European countries, is that this is a legitimate response. Now, that doesn't mean the British government will accept everything the Israeli government does, or the Israeli armed forces do. They may do things that we think are wrong, or even wicked.
Yes, we're coming on to those.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that is a legitimate issue, but that is a criticism of a specific event rather than the overall rights and wrongs of the conflict.
Right. Can we move on to the West Bank? Because quite a few people are exercising their views on that. Linda Sherwood is probably the strongest expression. I feel you glossed over the last 10 years happenings that have seriously contributed to this outbreak of violence. Do you not think the expansion of Israeli settlements and the siege of Gaza over the last 16 years has not effected this or brought this about? Trevor, given that the West Bank was originally part of Jordan, is it not reasonable for it to remain 100% Arab? Pat, could there ever be a two-state solution while there are illegal Israeli settlements on the West Bank? And would there ever be the political will on the part of Israel for them to be removed in order for an agreement to be reached? And John Skinner, he thinks they're too extensive now for a two-state solution to be possible. Yeah. So would you like to sort of chew on that?
There's a number of points there. I'll try and deal with them. First of all, I do agree that the policy of the Israeli governments, particularly the present one, but also some of their predecessors for at least the last 10, 15 years, has, in my view, been wrong. They have basically said the Palestinians are in the West Bank and in Gaza. We can control their ability to create mischief, to attack us. Therefore, we're going to concentrate purely on our relationship with the Arab states around. And they've been very successful in getting a number of Arab countries, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, all to establish diplomatic relations with Israel in a way that they wouldn't have done in the past. And the Saudis are doing so now. I don't have any problem with that. I think that's all highly desirable. But what they've neglected is to consider what is their long-term relationship with the Palestinians. And it's obviously not stable, the situation that has existed in the last few years. Now, your questioner who said, is it not too late to have a peaceful resolution? Think of the settlements. Two answers to that. First of all, the Israelis actually had settlements in Gaza at one time. And when the Israeli government in 2005 decided to withdraw all its army, its military, not to be involved in Gaza, they could look after themselves, they actually ordered the settlements to close down. And when there was a lot of resistance from the settlers in Gaza, there weren't huge numbers of them, but there were about a dozen settlements. They were all, by force, closed down and removed. So you can reverse these things if there is a political will to do so as part of a greater agreement. On the wider issue of the settlements, what's worth remembering, there are about 100 settlements in the West Bank. I don't think they should have been built. I personally think these have made the problem far more difficult than it would otherwise have been. But it so happens that something like 80% of them are in areas of the West Bank very close to the Israeli border. And when Barak was prime minister and almost did a deal with Arafat that I mentioned earlier on, one of the things that they discussed was maybe that you could change the boundary of Israel and the West Bank so that these settlements, which were within a couple of miles of Israel anyway, would become part of Israel, and Israel was considering exchanging that with some territory of its own, which could be transferred to the West Bank, up in the north of Israel. Now, that never happened, but both sides were looking at something of that kind as a contribution towards easing, not resolving, but easing the problem of settlements. But this final point I would make on the question of a two-state solution, is it feasible? I would be quite simple about it. There isn't an alternative. If it's not a two-state solution, then some people have discussed, well, maybe we should have a one-state solution. It should just be one country. It's one of these lovely theoretical things that the more you think about it, the more absurd it sounds. I mean, the idea that you could create a single state, which is 60% Israeli, 40% Palestinian, and say they're one country and they're all going to love each other after the history of the last 50 years, is absurd. Sometimes issues are so strong that people cannot live with their neighbors. We saw that between India and Pakistan, when India became independent in 1947. We saw it within Pakistan, between West and East Pakistan, which East Pakistan is now Bangladesh. We saw it in Cyprus, between the Turks and the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots. So we've seen it in Kashmir. So this is it's a very serious example, but it's an example of a phenomenon that is not unique. And sometimes when two people, for either good reasons or bad reasons, cannot live together in the kind of harmony that we would hope for, then it is better they should separate. And if that's the only solution that even in theory is available, then the quicker you start working on it in practice, the better. And we came quite close. When I say we, the Israelis and the Palestinians came quite close on a couple of occasions. Whether the deal would have worked, even if they had signed it, we'll never know. But it's not as if they've never been prepared to treat each other in a more acceptable way. And that's why I used the story of Arafat going to give his condolences to Leah Rabin's widow after he was assassinated, something that would be inconceivable at this moment in time.
Anyone upstairs who want the microphone? Yes, there's one over there. I'm just going to ask one question while you're getting the microphone. And this is about anti-Semitism. There are two countervailing questions here, Malcolm. Lisette says, I'm very concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism in this country in recent weeks. Should I be? Whereas Val says, can you explain why any criticism of Israel is considered anti-Semitic when it has a secular government? Criticisms of government in Iran is not immediately considered Islamophobic.
Right. I don't think anybody would sensibly suggest that criticism of the Israeli government is anti-Semitic, because half the Israelis criticize their government and do so in the most vitriolic terms. I mean, we've had just over the last year literally hundreds of thousands of Israelis every week demonstrating against the reforms that Netanyahu was trying to impose upon Israel. And on the question of Israel's relationship with the Palestinians, there is a big chunk of Israeli MPs who want a two-state solution. They're not a majority at the moment, but they've always been a very substantial part of the Israeli public. So it's not so much criticism of Israel. I think what the Israelis, and I can't speak for them, but I think what the Israelis say is that the criticism pointed at Israel doesn't apply when controversial things happen elsewhere. So when China is responsible for terribly maltreating the Uyghurs, who happen to be Muslim, and they're all sent off to re-education camps and treated as prisoners and so forth, none of the Muslim states attack China for doing that. Why? Because they have their own national reasons for wanting to be chummy with China. It's not because they like it or approve it, but they don't criticize them. So it's the concern of the Israelis is this is too one-sided. On the question of anti-Semitism, what has happened, for example, in Britain is quite interesting and disturbing, very, very disturbing. There has been a substantial increase in the number of anti-Semitic incidents. There is also, not so much, but there has also been a significant increase in Islamophobic incidents in Britain, of Muslims being either attacked or criticized or insulted or whatever. So that is what happens when emotions are very high. The other point I would make, and I'm not sure everybody would necessarily agree with this, but I think it's valid. When we talk of anti-Semitism in the old days, say in the 1930s, that was Oswald Mosley, a friend of Hitler's, and it was being anti-Jewish because Jews deserve to be treated in that way. Such people still remain, but that's not the main issue at the moment. The main issue at the moment is overwhelmingly your views on Palestine. And if you feel very, very strongly that Palestinians are being unfairly treated and the Israelis are bad guys, then there are not many Israelis to attack in Britain apart from the Israeli embassy. So if you meet somebody who's obviously Jewish, or you see some Jewish synagogue or whatever, you assume that most Jewish people tend to be more pro-Israeli than more Palestinian. That must be the case. But therefore, so if you feel strongly about it and you're upset and hostile, you make rude remarks, you make insulting remarks of that kind. So I'm not saying it's acceptable. It's not remotely acceptable, whether it's against black people or Jews or Muslims or any minorities. The ethical arguments are exactly the same. It's despicable. But I'm saying that the anti-Semitism that we've seen, for example, on the Palestine-Israel issue, is something very different to the anti-Semitism of the 1930s and what happened, the terrible things that happened at that time.
We've got a question upstairs. He's near the back on the right-hand side.
Okay. Good evening. My question is to do with one of your previous roles as Secretary of Defense. My understanding is that the Israeli security forces are one of the best in the world. What I find difficult to understand is how thousands and thousands of rockets were able to be launched at Israel without the security forces being able to identify that something was happening. Perhaps you'd be able to, again, with your previous experience, just give an indication as to how that could have occurred.
Right. First of all, the Israelis were well aware of all the rockets that Hamas possessed. It's believed to be something like 4,000 or 5,000 of them. A lot of them are pretty rudimentary. Some of them are homemade. Some of them were supplied by Iran and smuggled into Gaza. They can do a lot of damage, but at the end of the day, they can't destroy Israel. And there were various incidents involving rockets over the last few years. The misjudgment was not that they didn't know the weapons that Hamas had. What they failed to identify was that Hamas, the attack that took place couldn't have been decided in 48 hours. There must have been several weeks, possibly 2 or 3 months of planning, because it was very well, Hamas militants entered Israel by land, sea, and air, quite literally. Most of them by land, crossing the border into Israel. Some went by boat, because Gaza has a coastline, and managed to land on Israeli coastline. Some came in as paragliders from the air. Not huge numbers, but some. So that was the intelligence failure. Now, you're quite right, Israel's intelligence agencies have a reputation, still have a reputation of being hugely impressive. And I know from the time that I chaired the Intelligence and Security Committee in Britain, which has oversight of MI6, MI5, that British intelligence, Israeli intelligence, American intelligence is amongst the very best in the world. But, you know, our intelligence didn't get the Falklands right. You know, the Argentinians invaded us, and we didn't know they were coming until they arrived. The intelligence agencies are exceptionally good, but they cannot always get it correct. I'm just about to break the Official Secrets Act, and I'm going to reveal to you a top-secret document. This is quite true, I'm not inventing this. Top-secret document that I received when I was Foreign Secretary. And this is when Mr. Yeltsin was president of Russia, and he was coming to the end of his first term. And the question was, would he be able to have a second term? And although people didn't like talking about it too much, he had a drink problem. He was an alcoholic, and it was believed that his health was very, very poor. And one I used to get each day, the Prime Minister got it, but I, as Foreign Secretary, got it, as did 1 or 2 other ministers, the summary of what the intelligence agency's up-to-date information was. And I opened my red box, and I am breaking the law, technically, but you'll find out why I'm not too worried about it on this particular occasion. Top secret document. It said to the Prime Minister and to other ministers, we have a report on Mr. Yeltsin, and what we're about to advise ministers, we have discussed with our German, French, and American colleagues, and we all agree with this view, that it does not matter whether Mr. Yeltsin stands at the next Russian election, and whether, if he does stand, whether he wins or loses, because he's going to be dead within 6 months because of the state of his kidneys and his general health. He lived for another 10 years. Now, it's not that they were incompetent, at least I don't know for certain. I suspect what happened is they did have a source, one of his doctors. He had a whole team of doctors looking after him, and they probably had somebody who gave a genuine even doctors, dare I say it, occasionally get the prognosis wrong. So, you know, intelligence agencies can sometimes be a bit like that.
Thank you for that. Let's move into the arena that we were exploring last week with Yasmin Ahmed, and that's about human rights. And I'll just give you the flavour of several comments. Dave Bayliss, why are the Western powers not removing civilians and landing aid by sea? 1,500 Israelis were killed, and so far 9,000 Gazians, mostly civilians. What revenge ratio do you think will be acceptable to Netanyahu, is how he puts it. Jill is down. Hamas attack was horrendous. Israel was bound to respond. However, if Israel is justified in defending itself by bombing Gaza to bits and denying fuel, food, and water to Palestinian citizens, at what point is its actions not justified? Harry and Zina, our 2 students. What do you think about the fact that Israel is denying Palestinians of their basic human rights, such as clean water and electricity?
Okay. Some of the criticisms, I think, are valid. I do not think it was right, myself, to have the block on water, electricity, to interfere with the internet and so forth. not because Hamas could not benefit if these supplies continued. Hamas does benefit. It's a question of proportionality, whether the benefit to Hamas was such as to justify denying all the basic commodities for the population as a whole. Now, that's been for a relatively short period, because there aren't, a week or so, even that's bad enough, but you've now got, I think, increasing numbers of trucks of aid coming into Gaza from Egypt, and that's the Israelis are allowing through. So that, I think, is being addressed, but it shouldn't have happened in the first place. So there I would go along with some of that criticism. I think that the questioner who talked about the revenge ratio, I think that is unfair, except that Mr. Netanyahu's rhetoric sometimes sounds as if that's the sort of language he chooses to use. But I think that the basic problem, and it's an ethical dilemma in all conflicts, we had, in a lesser degree, the same problem dealing with the IRA when innocent people sometimes got killed. We certainly had these problems, as did other Western countries, in Afghanistan or in Iraq during the Gulf War. And the numbers might have been different, but constantly the British government or the West American government, whoever it was, would say, look, you know, we're trying to eradicate terrorists. And terrorists, because of the nature of the people they are, they use a hospital, a school, innocent people, built up parts of the city, so that they hope these places cannot be subject to attack because civilians might get injured as a result. So one can criticize that, but the alternative, it means that you are letting the terrorists win the day. And when, and I use the example, the best example, because it's so close, is the ISIS controlling the final redoubt they had when they had been defeated elsewhere, was the city of Mosul, which was a city of about 1 million people in northern Iraq. And the ISIS fanatics were behaving exactly the same way as Hamas. They were deliberately a rational thing for them to do. They were in each building where ordinary people were living, and in order to eradicate them, a lot of innocent people died as well. Now, my guess is that the judgment of history will be that the liberation of Mosul, which destroyed ISIS, was an unfortunate necessity in the sense of the civilian casualties. It's too early to know what the judgment will be with regard to what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. My guess is if they did not do it at all, if they simply said, because there's a risk to casualties, or more than a risk, a certainty, that some innocent people will die, we're not going to use any military means against Hamas, then Hamas would repeat what they did in 6 months' time. And then in 2 years' time. And then, you know, it would continue, because they would be more and more powerful and feeling that they were invincible. And at some stage, what we are seeing now would become necessary, because there is no civilized government, including our own, that could live with that kind of threat if it had the military means to stop it, even if, sadly, some innocent people will die.
We have plenty of questions on the table, but if you'd like the microphone, please put up your hand. Oh, there's one here. All right, go ahead.
Thank you, Sir Malcolm. You spoke briefly about the reasons the surrounding states don't like Hamas, but their own populations hold them back from that. To what degree do they need to change from that position for Hamas to go the way of ISIS?
Sorry,
The surrounding states, which are sort of holding back from involvement against Hamas, what's necessary for that position to change? And is it a requirement for Hamas to be defeated?
Well, I don't think it will change. If you're asking, will the Egyptian government or the Jordanian government or other of the moderate governments change their position? No, they won't, because they would be as horrified about Hamas as a terrorist organization using the means they have, because they would face the same, they did face the same problems with ISIS and Al-Qaeda. The Saudi government, for example, ISIS said quite open, Al-Qaeda used to say quite openly, Osama bin Laden, his main target, the Israelis were the second most important, his main target was to destroy the Saudi government and replace them with Al-Qaeda type people in their place. So all the Arab governments will not change their fundamental policy. What they will do, however, is take account of domestic opinion on what is often called the Arab street, ordinary people demonstrating and so forth. They will use a rhetoric that is more pro-Palestinian than they might have chosen, and they might, for example, suspend diplomatic relations. There's a report today that Bahrain may have withdrawn its ambassador from Israel. Now that will be a temporary thing, but it's a way of saying to their own public opinion, we're not just being pro-Israeli, far from it. We are upset by what they're doing. So I think one has to make a distinction between how they see their self-interest. See, the reason the Saudis and the Israelis have been talking about normalizing their relations isn't because they've suddenly decided they love each other. It is because they both fear Iran. The Iranians and the Saudis have been sworn enemies for years. The Iranians and the Israelis, for different reasons, are equally sworn enemies. And in this imperfect world we all live in, occasionally my enemy's enemy is my friend. It's happened during the Second World War, when Churchill and Roosevelt, when the Soviet Union was invaded by Hitler, Stalin became an ally of Churchill and Roosevelt, not because we didn't know he was a wicked man, but because the overriding requirement was to defeat Hitler. And therefore, for the time being, that was assisted by having the Soviet Union, America, Britain all on the same side. So in a different way, but in a comparable way, the Saudis and the other Arab countries who are deeply alarmed at the possibility that Iran might acquire nuclear weapons, for them, Israel is not an ally, that's taking it too strong, but someone they're only too happy to have a relationship with because they have a common concern.
One quick specific, then we've got some broader questions I'd like us to get through, and then there's a few non-Israel questions for you. Chris Spicer, can you hold out any hope for the future of the hostages?
Say it again?
Have you got any hope for the future
of the
hostages?
Well, clearly Hamas see the hostages as having, that's the leverage they've got. They haven't got much leverage. They know that the Israelis attach huge importance to getting Israeli hostages released. There have been already a very small number released. The concern is, will they just kill the Israeli hostages? They might, at some stage, or kill some of them. But of course, Hamas knows that if they kill the hostages, they have no more leverage. They have no more pressure they can put on the Israelis in terms of Israeli domestic public opinion. So my guess is that most of the Israeli hostages will survive this episode, this period. I'll be delighted but astonished if they all do.
I've got some questions here that I'm actually going to couple them together because I think you might enjoy exploring this. And it's about statesmanship and it's about gender. You'll be surprised to hear, right. So let's put it to you this way. Dennis Taylor, in your opinion, is there the quality of statesmen on both sides to deliver a solution? Mark Dolmer put it differently. In your memoirs, you lament that Israel and Palestine are led by politicians and not statesmen. How does politics in Israel-Palestine need to change to achieve an enduring solution? Whereas we've got two questions, interestingly, they're from women members. Diane Walton, do you think that if there had been more female world leaders in the past and present, we'd have had a permanent solution to Palestine-Israel by now? And Jan Ferguson, we've heard today about male domination in government negatively influencing COVID decisions. How many women's voices are equally heard on both sides in the political dialogue that is so crucial to any hope of peace in Israel-Palestine?
Well, you asked whether women were the solution to women political leaders were the solution to the problem. You're speaking to someone who had to work under Margaret Thatcher for 11 years. It concentrates the mind wonderfully. I'm not sure that being a peacemonger was her greatest claim to fame. She won the Falklands War. I mean, she was the warrior chief at that particular time. So I don't think it's wise. Mrs. Gandhi was a pretty militant Indian lady prime minister. And, of course, Golda Meir was one of the most important Israeli prime ministers. So I don't think women necessarily are the gentle sex, and certainly not the ones who become prime minister, put it that way. On your question of statesmen versus politicians, and you're part quoting my own comments, sometimes the circumstances produce the statesman. Churchill would never have been prime minister if it hadn't been for the circumstances of 1940, when Britain faced the possibility of invasion and defeat by Hitler. Up till then, Churchill had not been acceptable to many politicians as their prime minister. Margaret Thatcher actually might very well not have become the prime minister she was successful in being, not just because of the Falklands, but because of all the industrial and other issues that the country were crying out for fairly radical changes. Israel and the Arabs have produced statesmen in the past. And I used the example of Arafat and Rabin working together. There is a man, a Palestinian, who's in an Israeli prison at the moment called Barghouti. And he is someone who I've not met him, I've read about him. He is occasionally mentioned as he's in prison because of his Palestinian nationalist. He was convicted in an Israel court of criminal offenses, but he's seen as someone as having the potential to be a much more effective leader if he was released in the way that Mandela was released by the South Africans when they decided to change their system. So that might be possible on the Palestinian side. And I'm not the slightest doubt that the Israelis have produced again and again people who have been generals who become peacemakers. Yitzhak Rabin was a general. Ehud Barak was a general. And one can give Sharon, who withdrew the Israelis from Gaza in 2005, had been a general. Because the distinction between military and civilian is much looser in Israel, where every citizen is expected to bear arms if called upon to do so, because the population is too small to produce an effective army otherwise.
I've got lots of questions to finish off, and we're moving away from Israel-Palestine now. I don't know how you feel. You said you're a private citizen now, but these three questions are all asking you to comment on the current Conservative government. Do you want to have a go at that? Well, you don't have to answer.
Well, no, the current Conservative...
You haven't had the question
No, on the
yet.
current... Well, no, I thought you had asked me the question.
No, that's not the question.
It's not the answer.
No. So Dave Martin, I'll just go through them to get the flavour of what the audience is saying. So we've had 14 years of Conservative government under 5 prime ministers. However, has the true leader of the party been Nigel Farage? And if he rejoins the party, could he be a future leader? Paul McCann, following the recent revelations at the COVID inquiry, could you ever see yourself in a government led by Boris Johnson? And John Mottram, listening to the testimony of the COVID inquiry, do you despair at how that government of your party acted? If today's crisis developed, would the Sunak government be better? So you can see the flavour. Do you want to make any general comment?
I think your questions are lowering the tone of the evening.
Fine. Okay.
That wasn't my whole answer. No, to try and give you a more specific answer, I actually have a great deal of time for Rishi Sunak. I think he's been an excellent prime minister, is being an excellent prime minister. And I had no time. If I was having a dinner party, I'd love to have Boris Johnson any day. He would be marvellous. But I always thought he was totally unfit to be prime minister. He's not immoral, he's amoral. He doesn't actually have a moral compass, to be perfectly honest. And I thought Truss was an absurdity. And in both cases, it was like Berlusconi becoming prime minister of Britain. They just were not fit for these jobs. And I think Sunak has returned. He is a serious guy. He's a highly intelligent guy. He's already done a lot to restore Britain's relationship with France. He and Macron get on very well. He did the deal on Northern Ireland, the backstop, the very difficult negotiations successfully, which has removed that from the scene. And in other circumstances, he ought to be able to look forward to a good number of years as Prime Minister. But 14 years is a long time, and we're a democracy. I think the big question in terms of British politics is, will Starmer and the Labour Party, they're likely to be the largest single party, but that doesn't necessarily mean they'll be able to have a majority. Because I think what's going to happen is that the Labour Party will win a significant number of seats in Scotland from the Scottish Nationalists, which incidentally I'm very pleased if that happens, because I like the Nationalists even less than I approve of the Labour Party. But that will help them become the largest party, the Labour Party. They'll win back a lot of seats in the north of England that they lost the last time round, unusually, unexpectedly. But I think in the south, if the Conservatives lose seats, it's more likely to be to the Liberal Democrats. So you could end up with a situation, which we've had before. If you think of the Wilson-Callaghan government, 74 to 79, that was 5 years when there was no coalition. It was a Labour government, but it did do deals with the Liberals in order to not have a general election. But, of course, that led to Margaret Thatcher. So it's an ill wind.
Apologies for having taken you into party politics briefly, and we'll go back to your elder statesman role, and we'll finish up with a question that it actually reads, if Trump becomes president, ... exclamation mark.
Right. I think Trump is even ghastlier than Boris Johnson, and that's saying something. No, because he was President of the United States. And you see, we have, with all our faults in Britain, when a mistake is made, because we have the benefit of not having a rigid written constitution, we can get rid of failed prime ministers as soon as members of parliament decide they're a liability. So Johnson, despite his huge majority in parliament, it all collapsed. And Truss, obviously, 46 days. An American president, it takes 4 years unless you can impeach them, and that's almost impossible. So I hope to God that Trump does not become president of the United States again. We'll survive it if he does. We survived the first 4 years, and we'll survive the second. Churchill, who had an American mother, made a splendid remark once. He said, you can always rely on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried every other option.
Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we've welcomed an elder statesman of this country to explore a really delicate and difficult situation. I thought his talk to us unfolded the whole situation in a very even-handed way, and I think he's explored all your questions very honestly, very candidly, as he promised he would, and I think it's been a very rewarding and informative evening. I'm so grateful to Sir Malcolm Rifkind.